All right, so here's a quick background on some African poetry. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer these three questions. What are the three eras of African poetry? What are some of the themes, focuses from each era? And how has African poetry changed or stayed the same? Remember that any of these screens you see with the important picture up in the corner, you'll want to take these down in your notes since you can use these on your quiz later on. I'll also pause the beginning of a slide so that you can hit pause on your recording, write down the notes, and then hit play again. All right, so some basic information for you. There are over 50 countries with hundreds of different cultures in Africa. Many African poems, when they're translated, they appear to be free verse, but they still contain some poetic elements, rhyme, assonance, alliteration, but repetition is the most common. So when I say most, keep in mind there's a lot of different countries, a lot of different cultures, so this is just most. Religious poems can contain Islamic references, Christian references, traditional religious references, or even a combination of all of them. Imagery is frequently focused on, a lot of focus on the environment, nature, things like that. This one you don't need to write down, but the three eras that I'm going to cover: pre-colonial era. This was before Africa was widely colonized by Europeans in the late 1800s. The colonial era, 1800s to the independence time, and post-colonial era, independence to today. There's not one clear date as far as independence, because if you look at this map, different countries got independence at different times. Egypt, 1922, whereas Libya next to it, 1951. So different countries got different times. That's why the colonial era says it ends when they get their independence. The pre-colonial poetry. So these are poems that are often meant for the whole community. In Europe and Asia, we see a lot of poems that are written by educated people for educated people. This is different in Africa. Most of the pre-colonial poetry was remembered. If you remember when we read the Sundiata epic, they talked about the Jali. His position was to memorize everything. So we get oral traditions at this time. This type of poetry, it's not written down for a long time, and oftentimes it gets written down by Europeans when they come in, and they weren't so much interested in writing it down in a poetic way so much as writing it down in a fact information kind of way. But we get a lot of common themes, a lot of teaching young people how to act by praising proper behavior or condemning improper behavior. We get some love type poetry, although that's, I think, more common in Egypt than in other parts of Africa. Well, a lot of historical stuff and a lot of religious stuff. And then the types of poetry we get: proverbs, prayers, songs, call and response poetry, oral stories like Sandiata, and folk tales. Colonial poetry. So this is when Europeans had colonized the country. We get poems, written poems become a lot more common. Many poems were still written for the masses, the regular people, not just the rich people. And a lot of these poems are actually written to be spoken. In Europe, a lot of poems, and Asia, a lot of poems were written to be kind of just read, and again, still for most, a lot of wealthy people. There will be a lot of heavy influence from European type poetry. We'll start to see things like sonnets or rhyme schemes and what have you starting to come in. A lot of our common themes during this era: conflict. The 7 types of conflict are down below here. Talk about slavery, liberation, independence, What does it mean to be uh, Negro, which is called negritude? This is a phrase that was actually copyrighted by someone who wrote a big paper about this out of Africa. Equality and oppression. So the 7 types of conflict: past versus present, tradition versus modern, individual versus community, socialism versus capitalism. Capitalism is making money, socialism is kind of helping everybody. Development versus self-reliance. Remember, development, you kind of are going to rely on outside forces to help you develop, outside companies, outside countries, outside money, versus being reliant on yourself. Indigenous versus foreign. Indigenous being the local people who were born here, raised here, foreign being outsiders. And then the same guy who copyrighted Negritude talked about basically what does it mean to be African versus non-African. So kind of like humanity versus Africanity, as he called it. All right, remember that colonialism ends at different times for different countries, so we have different dates for different countries. We get a huge boom in the amount of poetry from the mid to late 1900s to now. The 7 conflicts from the colonial era are still very common, but other themes include family, healing, healing the nature, healing the community, healing all of Africa, healing the self, healing family, healing. Modern issues: civil wars, gender equality, corruption in the government, economic issue, problems with modernization, things like pollution, loss of values, whatever. And we get more poets moving into this Eurasian style of poetry where if you don't have an education background, you're going to miss some things. If you don't have a higher vocabulary, you might miss some things. Use of different types of things like sonnets or whatever. So that becomes a little more common. I'd still say it's not all that common, but it's a little more common. All right, styles. There's a lot of kind of looking back at what was done before the colonial period, borrowing things like including folklore into the poems, songs. I realized that I misspelt rhythms here. I apologize for that. Use of words like indigenous language words, things like that. Concepts, or even pidgin language. Pidgin it's kind of a mixture of native language and European language mixed together. For example, some people say Spanish mixed with English is called Spanglish. That's kind of a pidgin language. But overall, the biggest style is still free verse poetry. That's it. You get your notes. Any questions, comments, concerns, just ask.